The expert of all experts, as far as I'm concerned, is Keith Bennett, China expert and co-editor of Friends of Socialist China. Keith, welcome back, and let's start with you. How did you see the crisis? How do you think each side handled it?
Right, that's an interesting question. There was an awful lot of very, very heated rhetoric in the Chinese media, and particularly on Chinese social media, but also in some papers like the Global Times in the build-up to Pelosi's visit. I never thought that the kind of more, shall we say, extreme suggestions would be carried through, because as you intimated, that could have easily triggered a war that could easily have turned into a nuclear war. But there was undoubtedly some disappointment among public opinion in China that the initial response when Pelosi landed was not what perhaps people were hoping for. And I think that's a very important factor to keep in mind, that consistently in the West, people don't take public opinion into account in China, and public opinion in China is very vocal and very organized on social media. And people in China feel intensely and emotionally about Taiwan in a way that it's actually very hard, I think, for people in the West to actually appreciate just how deeply they feel about it. So there was a kind of feeling that Pelosi had come and gone, and if you like, the Americans had got away with it. And then we saw the Chinese response starting to unfold, the economic measures, the suspension of cooperation with the United States on a whole range of issues, and of course, the military exercises around Taiwan, which were quite unprecedented in their scope and scale. And what they actually showed was China's ability to completely surround Taiwan and in effect to blockade it if they so chose. And a short period of blockade by China of Taiwan will cause, immense havoc on global supply chains. I mean, forget the idea of getting a new mobile phone if that happens because of semiconductor production and so on. Of course, the Americans have protested very strongly about that. The Chinese response has been quite simple: don't say that we didn't warn you. But I think what's also important is what you said about the idea of revenge being a dish best eaten cold, in that what we saw was the beginning of the rolling out of a process. And this is not an issue that is going to go away, because I think that the Chinese leadership have concluded that what the United States has really been doing is salami slicing the One China policy, which they signed up to in 3 Sino-US joint communiques, which is the premise on which US-China diplomatic relations exist. And that if they didn't take a stand now, then the whole One China policy and the whole basis of China-US relations would collapse. And I think it's very important also to understand that the Chinese always take a very long view of this. Their agenda is not driven by the morning's headlines, as British politics and American politics are. And I just like to put this into some kind of perspective. The first Indian ambassador to the People's Republic of China was a man called Radhakrishnan. In fact, he was the last Indian ambassador to Chiang Kai-shek, the first to Mao. So he wrote a memoir called Into China's, meaning the pre-liberation China and post-liberation China. And he talks about being taken around the Summer Palace in Beijing, which had been burnt to the ground by the 8 Allied powers, led by Britain and France at the turn of the 20th century. And the guide taking them around, and this is already 50 years later, itemizes what the British and the French stole and so on, and said, one day we're going to make them pay for this. So watch this space.
Let's assume no apocalypse, no war. How does China reunify this last piece of its jigsaw?
Well, Michael really made the point that things are actually on one level quite difficult now because of the trouble that there was in Hong Kong, which in my view was basically stirred up by outside forces, Britain and America, to undermine the one country, two systems policy. So there is a, there's a problem there. But what's missing, and what's missing in what my friend over there just said, is that one of the reasons why Taiwan's economy has been doing rather well is that by far its biggest trading partner is mainland China. And at least in pre-COVID times, millions of people cross the Taiwan Straits every year. Taiwan has massive investment on the mainland. There are hundreds of thousands of Taiwanese people on the mainland living, working, having families, running businesses, studying, and so on. And this process was really going quite well. I mean, people forget, because memories are very short in the West, but in 2015, Xi Jinping and the then leader of Taiwan, Ma Ying-jeou, had a pretty cordial meeting in Singapore and reached a whole lot of agreements. And it's only then when the Democratic Progressive Party came in that they've wrecked that and brought us to a situation which could be the edge of war. But what they're doing doesn't represent the interests of everyone in Taiwan. But China's proposal for one country, two systems and peaceful reunification is still on the table. But one thing which I think has been touched on during this discussion, one thing that's really not negotiable is that China, no matter what, when it comes to it, no matter what the cost, will not back down on this question of reunification, because it is the final piece in the jigsaw, if you like, of returning China to basically the place that China held in the world through most of recorded history. If you look at the last 2,000 years, China was the leading economy in the world in about 16, 17 of the last 20 centuries. And this century of humiliation, which began with the British smuggling drugs into China and leading to the first Opium War in 1840, this century of humiliation, the final undoing of that and the realization of what Xi Jinping calls the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation is the reunification of Taiwan with the motherland. And if it means, war with the United States, that's the last thing that China wants to see, but they won't back down from it. And I just finish with, again, based on some of the things that Michael was saying about his experiences in China, there's a book by a British businessman called Tom Clissold, who's lived in China for many years, and he recounts going to a small remote village in China, and a little boy of 6 or 7 realizes that he's from Britain, and he comes up and says, "You're the people responsible for the Opium War." Now, no one in British schools knows about the Opium Wars, but in China they do.
In China, they do.